Over the past few weeks, the Social Action Group and others within the LJS have been asking, how can our community help to combat racism? We call ourselves a diverse and inclusive congregation, but do we demonstrate those values in the way that we conduct ourselves, in our actions and words? With the Board of Deputies setting up a commission to look at how our community relates to Jews of colour, the LJS felt it was time to explore this issue ourselves. This morning, we have invited two guest speakers, but well known in our congregation, to begin a conversation which we hope will be continued long into the future. Dr. Edie Friedman is well placed to guide our community through some of these questions with a lifetime of experience in fighting for racial equality. She was born in Chicago and moved to the UK more than 40 years ago. Concerned to strengthen the link between social justice and Jewishness, in 1976 she founded the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, JCORE, of which she is now the executive director. In 2014, she co-founded Shalom, the rabbinic call for economic and social justice in the UK. She has also authored and co-authored a series of race equality education resources covering the primary school to adult age ranges, and is a regular speaker and writer on race and asylum issues, and is no stranger to the LJS. Edie is going to be in conversation with Jonathan Bromfield. Jonathan is a member of the LJS, and this coming September will enter his final year at the University of Oxford, reading philosophy, politics, and economics. He is a member of the LJS and has volunteered at the drop-in for asylum seeker families here. Jonathan was elected president of the Jewish Society at Oxford University this past year. Edie and Jonathan, as you turn on your microphones and cameras, let me just say that I am so delighted that you've agreed to start this conversation for us this morning. It is 55 years since Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel responded to Martin Luther King's invitation to join the Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights. We are still marching and must continue to do so until racism as a blight on our conscience and in all societies is eliminated. I invite you now to begin your conversation.
Well, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to have this conversation. And we hope that this morning we will begin to explore two main issues. Firstly, racism within the Jewish community, to include the situation of Jews of color. And secondly, how best can we mobilize our community to play a more active role in combating racism generally within British society? And of course, I know we will only scratch the surface of both these topics, but we hope, as you said, Rabbi Alex, that this morning will lead us to many more conversations in the very near future. So I'd like to begin by asking you, Jonathan, that you have spoken about the different spaces that you occupy with being both Black and Jewish. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So I think quite simply, sort of, it's kind of, I kind of like sort of go through lots of different spaces that are quite difficult to kind of, that I stand out in. I mean, from my university kind of situation, I'm a minority, and it's quite visual that I am, sort of a minority there. And because of not being a typical member of that kind of space, I think it means that, I sort of end up facing things that, sort of my fellow like students don't. And I think likewise, a similar thing happens with Jewish spaces. Again, I don't look typically Jewish. So once again, I also face these kind of things that, you know, sort of my friends and stuff who are Jewish but don't sort of stick out as much have to face.
And I guess there's a real challenge to look at what Black people and Jewish people have in common, because I know obviously there are lots of forces out there which can divide us, and how hard our various communities, and of course we don't have one Jewish community as we don't have one Black or one Asian community, but how can we acknowledge differences at the same time as acknowledge what we share together?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I think it's kind of quite difficult because, especially with discussions of race, it's really easy to kind of just sort of there's a tendency to generalize. By the nature of racism, it is a generalization about a given group of people. But I think there is an awareness of the implications of persecution and suffering on both sides, which I think is a common theme between, you know, sort of the Jewish community and sort of the Black community. And I think one of the issues that I think that the Jewish community can sometimes struggle with is not appreciating sort of the elements of privilege that that as a minority they do have, that, you know, sort of the Black community doesn't. And I think sort of that once, you know, people recognize those kind of privileges, I think it really can be utilized in order to kind of actually sort of help other minorities out. And I think we do have an obligation as Jews to, you know, wherever we can, you know, sort of be sort of advocates for persecution, which is, you know, a long and sort of important theme in sort of in sort of Jewish philosophy.
And also the positive things that unite us as well, because we know that minority communities can define themselves for obvious reasons in rather negative ways. And
Yeah.
now we have that balance. Jonathan, can you say something about your experience of being president of the Jewish Society at Oxford?
Yeah, so that was very interesting. I guess I was quite an atypical member of the JCORE, the Jewish Society, other than sort of being Black, but also being a progressive Jew. So being elected was, you know, quite interesting. And I think on the whole it was an amazing experience, and I think the Oxford Jewish community is really quite interesting. And I think it was a good opportunity. It showed me what in some ways it showed me very much like how the Jewish community could be, and how, you know, sort of we can live side by side with differences and sort of still sort of really make change and cooperate on some stuff. I think there was definitely sort of I think the students were much better at sort of recognizing me as just another member of the community than I think sort of necessarily maybe in other spaces where I was sort of JSOC president. I think there was a little bit more sort of I think suspicion is probably unfair, but kind of sort of at least shock. And obviously that was quite difficult to deal with, but and could be quite upsetting sometimes, because it felt like you know, did I actually deserve to be president? But you know, I don't think it, but you know, I kind of pushed through. But just because I pushed through doesn't mean that, you know, other people should just push through. And some people don't actually have the sort of the desire or the sort of emotional capacity. You know, it's quite sort of it's not nice to feel like your sort of your personhood or elements of your personhood is being attacked. And I don't think there is a obligation on people of color to have to just push through really difficult things. Yeah,
Absolutely. But one could hope that your experience of the Jewish Society in Oxford could also be a model for other Jewish societies within the country. When you heard that the Board of Deputies was setting up this commission on what is the experience of Jews of color within Britain, what was your first reaction?
If I'm brutally honest, my first reaction was skepticism. I think often, it's really easy to, it's much easier to have conversations about race than it is to actually start to deal with structural issues that sort of Black Jews face. And my initial concern was that it would just become sort of just a conversation about sort of, the other in our community who happen to also be Jewish, and the issues that they face and instead of actually dealing with some real systemic and structural issues. I think one of the sort of fundamental things comes to mind is sort of extra heightened sort of sense of sort of questioning that I think sort of Jews of color end up facing when going into sort of Jewish spaces, often feeling even if the fact that they feel that they feel sort of heightened sense of sort of concern, I think kind of shows how really we are doing a disservice to people who absolutely deserve to be in our spaces. So it was initially quite, I'm a little bit skeptical, and I think it really needs to be hand in hand with real structural changes.
Which leads me to my next question, that I've certainly observed that the conversation about Black Jews can also quite quickly turn to so-called security concerns, for example, racial profiling by synagogue security staff, who else is viewing Black Jews as somewhat exotic. How do we move away from both of these rather negative perceptions of Black Jewish people? How do we continue the conversation, which we hope the Board of Deputies Commission will help people do, and other synagogues or other institutions are also looking at this issue? But there's a lot of negativity.
Yeah.
How do you think we could begin to break that up in a positive way?
I think, like you said, like what you said earlier about sort of, it's really easy for minorities, whether Jewish people, to like identify themselves as sort of against anti-Semitism, or Black people to identify themselves against racism. I think really sort of changing the sort of paradigm, the sort of seeing Jews of color as exotic and other, as different, I think really requires a positive appreciation. And I think that's just basically, I think fundamentally is just sort of a misappreciation of history, of what Jews look like, and a kind of just like quite a specific monolithic view. And I think sort of changing that, I think, requires sort of looking back and actually looking, sort of seeing that actually there have always been sort of Jews that have, it's never been a monolith. And anything that attempts to sort of describe Judaism in that way is actually sort of wrong. And only by looking at this positive, sort of looking at these different sort of aspects of Judaism and different sort of Jews, I think we'll be able to actually sort of slowly start to appreciate sort of difference within the Jewish spectrum as something that's always been there, as opposed to this exotic new thing that we've just discovered.
And certainly the opportunities which we hope synagogues will now take to look at their adult education. This is an issue, obviously it's not just one issue that can be a part of syllabus, might be too of a sort of technical term for it, but we could, and we should be able to integrate that as part of very complex issues that we've ignored for far too long. And finally, for this morning, Jonathan, what do you see as the link between one's own personal experience and political engagement? And what would you see as the priorities for tackling racism? I realize that's a very huge question. But if you could say something first about the personal and the political and how those two inform each other.
Sure. Yeah. So I'd probably say that on the one hand, we don't really, it's not fair to sort of as an individual, expect people to sort of do everything, you know, and that's a sort of unfair sort of task. But if you think about on a wider level, if no one does anything, then nothing gets done. So I think there's this kind of tension between, you know, the personal as yourself as an individual, but also the personal as part of a community. And I think once you kind of split it up into those two ways, you can see that actually there's this element of taking care of yourself, but there's also this element of taking care of your community. And I guess that community is the sort of wider community. And so I'd really say that they really are quite connected. And if you don't look after one side, then you're not able to look after the other. I think, you know, it's kind of yeah.
And by combining the personal and the political, I think it's important that we think through what change we would like to see. And I know that during the last few weeks since the murder of George Floyd, people have approached JCORE to say, what can we do to help Black people, which is not, I don't think, the best way to look at that, to look at the issue. But there is the big issue about how we can be involved in changing the structural endemic racism within British society as a positive thing for Jewish people to do. And so what would you see as some of the priorities for tackling racism? Because obviously we could all get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And how important it is to prioritize, even to set up timetables, to have a strategy so that we have the confidence that we know we are doing something.
Well, in some ways, I think that you're probably better at answering that question than me. But I think what I probably would want to say is that sort of having sort of sustained and significant dialogue with communities, I think is, you know, sort of paramount. You're not able to help people unless, or ask how that they, you know, I think ask how, you know, we can help you without actually having a really sort of having a discussion. And, you know, that, and I think there are like lots of organizations that, you know, would be very willing to sort of enter different spaces and talk about, you know, sort of the ways in which, you know, structurally and also on a personal level kind of change attitudes and behavior. And I think unless you're having this discussion as two equals, both with a goal to help one another, then I don't think you really are able to sort of, in a sort of really meaningful way, begin to sort of change sort of the ways in which systemic racism exists.
And do you think there are things which Black and Jewish people, and when I use the word Black, I mean, I would want to include Asian and other minority ethnic communities. It's also about maybe what we could do together to make our country a better place.
Yeah.
And very working together helps to break down inevitably the stereotypes that we all have of each other. We're all guilty.
Yeah.
And would you see this as one important thing for us to strive to do? And can it also be mirrored within university communities as well? Because, you know, we know that in some campuses, it's also been a tough time for Jewish students. And it's been a tough time for Muslim students. And how can we put these tough times into something positive? And what do we have to, obviously we can't wave a magic wand.
Of course.
But in a sense, I think we need to think about what's the next step and how, without, and I know that, you know, we know as Jewish people, when people say, what can we do to, you know, you have a responsibility to speak out about anti-Semitism. Well, we all have a responsibility, whether we're Jewish or not, in the same way that it's not the responsibility of Black and Asian people to talk about racism. This is something that we should all do. But do you think there is more that can be done within the university setting and therefore within the wider arena?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I think that actually worked within JSOC was the fact that there are a lot of events, especially regarding sort of social justice, in which there would be collaboration sort of beyond Abrahamic faith societies. And there was like a sort of a real sort of reciprocation in sort of, oh, we have this idea. Have any of you guys tried this before in resolving this issue? And I think the fundamental thing there is the fact that there is this kind of like sort of conversation that's continually being had between different people to tackle issues. And, you know, sort of we as a Jewish community probably can actually, you know, assist other communities who are like, you know, we want to help in anti-Semitism because of our unique perspective, i.e. the fact that we face it. And likewise, having a discussion with, you know, sort of, hopefully if the Board of Deputies Commission goes right, will actually be able to sort of kickstart a conversation where Black Jews are able to express the issues they have so that we can begin to have a conversation. And I think until you're having really meaningful and significant dialogue with one another on issues, I don't think anything really can change. And so I guess this thing that I would say that's sort of which needs to happen now is actually sort of taking the time to go out and speak to organizations who are very willing to sort of, who are organized to have discussions and to, you know, deal with these things and go, look, let's have a discussion about this. Yeah.
And I think that people need to
Edie,
come together and create that.
Yeah, Edie, I'm going to come in now because I really wanted us to continue. I didn't want to stop this conversation, but we have gone over our time, and I know that really I feel very mean and sad that I limited this conversation to 15 minutes between you both. But
thank you.
But I want to say a big thank you to both of you. Edie, for your penetrating questions to Jonathan and for bringing your experience and pointing a way forward for all of us. And Jonathan, for reminding us that it's an obligation on Jews to be advocates for persecution, and for your honesty. And I hope, as has been said, that this is just the beginning of a conversation and the uncovering of an iceberg. I really hope that we can pick up on the discussion around social justice that you mentioned, Jonathan. And finally, before we turn to our concluding prayers, Jonathan, I want to wish you a belated, very happy 21st birthday, which I know you celebrated last week. And again, to thank you both really from the bottom of my heart for being here, for really a conversation which is very much appreciated. The chat on our YouTube channel is also expressing great appreciation to both of you. So thank you both so much.
Thank you very much for that.